fight against coastal erosion with an unlikely tool, recycled oyster shells.
The shells act as a natural filter to get toxins out of the ecosystem.
Florida dumped 1.5 million tons of oyster shells offshore, and for a while, nothing happened. No headlines, no miracle, no press releases from marine biologists calling it a turning point. Just piles of discarded shells sitting on the seafloor, millions of them, stacked, scattered, settling into the silt. And the teams that put them there went home, wrote their reports, moved on to other projects. Because on paper, this was waste management with a modest ecological ambition attached. Nothing more. Then the data started coming back, and that's when the tone changed. Because if you map what formed out there, it doesn't look random. It doesn't look like waste. It looks structured, clusters, ridges, vertical growth patterns rising out of what used to be flat, empty seabed, shapes that don't appear by accident, formations that require something the ocean doesn't hand out easily: time, stability, and the right foundation. And here's the part that made experts pause. That kind of formation isn't supposed to happen that fast. We're not talking about decades of slow accumulation. We're talking about timelines that broke the models, growth rates that didn't fit the projections. And researchers who had studied reef development for their entire careers found themselves looking at data that didn't match what they'd seen before. Now step back for a second, because this didn't start as some grand environmental breakthrough. It didn't begin with a government initiative designed to save Florida's coastlines. It wasn't born in a lab. It wasn't the product of some visionary marine ecologist standing at a whiteboard. It started as disposal, that's it. For years, quietly, unglamorously, Florida has been collecting oyster shells from restaurants and processing plants, leftovers, scraps, the material that piles up when someone orders a dozen on the half shell or when a processing facility finishes its run for the day. Shells that would normally end up in landfills, shells that would get buried under trash bags and construction debris and all the ordinary detritus of modern life. Instead, they barged it offshore, loaded it onto vessels, drove it out to designated dump sites, and lowered it into the water. And on paper, the goal was simple: give oyster larvae something to attach to, because without hard surfaces, they can't survive. That's the bottleneck that most people don't realize exists. Oyster larvae, called spat, spend a brief window of time drifting through the water column looking for somewhere to land. They're not picky about where, but they are absolute about one thing: it has to be hard. Soft seafloor means no attachment. No attachment means no settlement. No settlement means no juvenile oysters. No juvenile oysters means no reef. So the logic was sound. The idea made sense. You take shells, which are already calcium carbonate, already the preferred attachment surface for oyster larvae, and you put them where the seafloor can't provide what the larvae need. You fill the gap, you solve the bottleneck. The expectation: slow, measured, careful, maybe results in years, maybe modest colonization rates in the first monitoring period. Some cautious optimism in the research reports, not what started showing up, because when researchers returned to those sites, what they would have expected to find is early-stage colonization. Maybe a thin veneer of biological activity, a few organisms testing the surface, minimal recruitment, minimal growth, the kind of results that keep a project alive on paper without inspiring anyone. Instead, they found density, layers forming, life stacking on top of life. Not a thin scatter of organisms spread out across the shells, but concentrated activity, aggregation, the kind of density that takes natural reefs years to develop, building in months. And that's what changes the equation, because when something builds upward instead of outward, it's not just settling, it's organizing. Something is happening that goes beyond simple colonization, something that ecology has a word for, but that most people never think about: succession. The process by which an ecosystem builds itself stage by stage, each phase creating the conditions for the next. And usually, it's slow. But sometimes, if the conditions are right, if the substrate is ideal, if the chemistry lines up, it accelerates. Now here's what's actually happening underneath that, at a level most coverage of this story never reaches. The shells aren't just sitting there. They're not passive. They're not inert objects waiting to be colonized, and they're changing the chemistry around them. Oyster shells are calcium carbonate, and when they hit seawater, they don't just dissolve, they interact. They create tiny microenvironments in the water directly around them. Slight shifts in pH localized alkalinity gradients, conditions that are marginally but measurably more favorable for biological attachment and growth than the surrounding open water. You don't see it, you can't feel it, but it's happening immediately the moment the shells hit the water. And that chemical shift is the first domino because it changes who shows up first. First comes bacteria, specific strains, chemotactic bacteria that respond to the altered conditions, that navigate toward the shells and begin to colonize the surface. Then biofilms, thin, almost invisible layers of microbial life that coat the shell surface. And biofilms don't just sit there either. They send chemical signals into the water, signals that oyster larvae, drifting, searching, waiting, are genetically programmed to detect. Because in the ocean, a biofilm means something was here before you. Something found this surface suitable. This is a safe place to land. So the larvae land, then come microalgae, diatoms, dinoflagellates, single-celled photosynthesizers that begin building up on and around the reef structure. And once that layer forms, everything else has something to build on. It's a chain reaction, one stage triggering the next, each phase creating the conditions that make the following phase possible. And if that chain reaction lines up perfectly, if the temperature is right, if the salinity is right, if the currents deliver larvae at the right moment, you don't get slow growth, you get acceleration, exponential, not linear. That's what started showing up in the data. Not just oysters, but entire systems forming around them. Fish, dozens of species, some using the reef as shelter, some using it as hunting ground, some just passing through but stopping, lingering, feeding. Crustaceans settling into the crevices between shells, filter feeders, mussels, barnacles, tunicates, hitching onto any available surface, predators appearing in response to the prey concentrations, sea stars, whelks, rays hovering at the edges, all responding to one thing: structure where there used to be none, a three-dimensional habitat suddenly existing in a place that offered nothing before. And here's why that matters more than it sounds. Because most artificial reefs don't actually create life, they attract it. They're biological magnets, not biological generators. You drop a decommissioned ship or a concrete block in the ocean and fish will show up. They will, but those fish came from somewhere. They were somewhere else before. The reef didn't produce them, it just redirected them. It concentrated existing life rather than generating new life, which means the total amount of marine biomass in the area hasn't necessarily increased. It just looks like it has because it's now concentrated in one visible place. But if juvenile species are surviving in those areas, if larvae are settling, growing to adulthood, reproducing, if recruitment is happening at a rate that exceeds what was there before, then you're not just moving life. You're generating it. You're adding net biological productivity to a system that didn't have it. That's a fundamentally different outcome. That's the difference researchers are trying to measure, trying to determine with confidence. And the early indicators, the density, the vertical growth, the presence of juvenile populations, suggest that this might be the latter, that these shell deposits aren't just reefs, they're engines, machines that run on biology instead of fuel, that produce rather than simply attract. Now take it one step further, because the implications compound. Each adult oyster filters up to 50 gallons of water a day. That's not a metaphor, that's physiology. An oyster pulls water across its gills, extracts phytoplankton and particulate matter, and pumps cleaner water back out. It's a living filtration unit. And when you multiply that across dense reef systems, across millions of oysters functioning simultaneously, day and night, regardless of whether anyone is watching, you're looking at billions of gallons of water being processed every single day. No machines, no power consumption, no maintenance staff, no operating budget. Just biology doing what biology does. And the downstream effects cascade: clearer water, light penetrating to greater depths, lower nutrient levels. The excess nitrogen and phosphorus that fuel algae blooms gets stripped out of the water column. Less algae, which means less hypoxia, less of the oxygen-depleted dead zones that have plagued coastal waters for decades. And when the water clears, something else can return: seagrass. And seagrass changes everything in ways that most people dramatically underestimate. Seagrass meadows are among the most productive ecosystems on the planet per unit area. They stabilize sediment, holding the seafloor in place against currents and storm surge. They improve visibility, which enhances the effectiveness of visual predators and affects the entire food web structure. They create nursery habitat for juvenile fish. Dozens of commercial and ecologically important species depend on seagrass as a nursery ground in their early life stages. They sequester carbon at rates that rival tropical rainforests. And once seagrass is established, it reinforces the water clarity that allowed it to return in the first place. Another feedback loop, another self-reinforcing cycle, stacked on top of the first one, running simultaneously, amplifying each other. That's how you go from waste to ecosystem, from a pile of discarded shells to a functioning, self-sustaining, biologically productive coastal system. But here's where experts start getting genuinely uneasy. Because systems like this don't just grow, they spread. And once they reach a certain density, once they hit what ecologists call the tipping point, they stop depending on what was originally dumped. They become independent, self-sustaining. Oysters reproduce. Spawning events release millions of larvae into the water column. Those larvae drift. They settle on the shells that the previous generation left behind. Their shells become new substrate, new generations attached to them. The reef expands without any additional input, without any barges, without any human coordination, without any ongoing management. And that's the part nobody fully controls. Because now you're not managing a project. You've triggered a process, and processes don't stop when the project does. They follow their own logic, their own rules, their own momentum. And once that momentum builds, once a reef system reaches a density where it's reproducing faster than it's dying back, you've crossed a threshold. You're no longer in the early stages of ecological rehabilitation. You're in something else, something self-directed. Now imagine mapping that over time. What starts as controlled deposition, shells placed deliberately in designated sites, monitored and measured, becomes an expanding biological structure, growing outward in directions the original plan didn't anticipate, adapting to local currents and substrate conditions, reshaping the seafloor according to its own internal logic, not the plan, its own logic. And if that structure reaches scale, we're talking about reefs that are kilometers in extent, not meters. It doesn't just affect marine life. It starts affecting the physical environment. Currents shift as water flows around and through reef structures. Sediment transport patterns change. The seafloor itself is altered. Coastal erosion dynamics, the slow, grinding loss of shoreline that costs Florida billions in property damage and infrastructure maintenance every year, begin to look different in the presence of large, healthy reef structures offshore. Which brings us to the data point that changed the conversation: storm data. When major storms hit, when hurricanes push walls of water toward the coast, areas backed by dense reef structures show something that areas without them don't: reduced erosion, lower wave energy at the shoreline, less storm surge penetration inland. Because reefs don't work like seawalls. Seawalls reflect force. They take the full energy of incoming waves and redirect it, which can actually increase erosion at the base of the wall and at unprotected areas nearby. Reefs are different. They break force, they absorb it, they dissipate it, spreading wave energy across a large, irregular, three-dimensional structure instead of concentrating it. The wave hits the reef. Part of the energy gets absorbed by the physical structure. Part gets scattered. Part gets converted into turbulence that dissipates before reaching shore. By the time the water gets to the beach, it's carrying less energy, less erosive force, less destructive potential, and unlike concrete seawalls, which crack, degrade, get undermined, require expensive maintenance, and eventually fail, reefs don't weaken over time. They rebuild. Storm damage that would compromise a concrete structure is absorbed and incorporated by a living reef. The shells break, new ones form, the structure recovers, which means every storm potentially makes them more robust, stronger in the specific ways that matter for coastal protection. Now think carefully. about what that implies. A system built from waste, from the shells that restaurants would have thrown away, that grows without ongoing investment, filters billions of gallons of water daily, generates net marine productivity rather than just redistributing it, creates cascading habitat that allows seagrass and fish populations to recover, and protects coastlines from storm erosion without degrading over time, without ongoing human input, without maintenance budgets, without staff, without power. That's not restoration. Restoration implies returning something to what it was. That's replacement. Building something that performs functions the original ecosystem performed, but doing it from scratch in degraded conditions with waste material, and doing it faster than the models said it should be possible. That's why the scientific community is paying close attention. Not because something went wrong, not because there's a cautionary tale embedded somewhere in the data, but because something worked faster and more effectively than anyone expected. And when that happens in ecology, the questions it raises are different from the questions we're used to asking. Because we're used to asking, did the intervention work? The question here is different. The question here is, how far does this go? Because we understand reasonably well how reefs form when conditions are right. We understand the biology, we understand the chemistry. What we don't have a complete model for is what happens when a reef system reaches sufficient scale in a degraded coastal environment that was previously unable to support it. What are the second-order effects, the third-order effects? How does a thriving reef system interact with the coastal fisheries that communities depend on? How does it interact with existing shipping lanes and navigation? How does it interact with the broader oceanographic patterns of the Gulf? These aren't rhetorical questions, they're real unknowns. And they're unknowns because nothing quite like this, at this scale in this environment, has been carefully studied before. The Florida Shell Recycling Program isn't the first oyster reef restoration effort in the world, but the scale of what appears to be forming and the speed at which it's forming puts it in a category that doesn't have a lot of direct precedent. And when something in nature scales like that, well, when it moves faster than expected, grows larger than modeled, produces effects that weren't anticipated, it raises a fundamentally different kind of question. Not, should we stop it? We couldn't stop it even if we wanted to. Not, did we make a mistake? The data doesn't suggest that. But what happens if this runs further than we can track? Because once systems like this reach momentum, once they cross the threshold from managed restoration to self-sustaining biological process, they don't check in. They don't file reports. They don't ask whether the original project parameters still apply. They just keep going, following the logic of biology, which has its own goals, its own timelines, its own definition of success. And here's the thing about biology: when it finds a favorable environment, it doesn't stop at what you planned for. It fills the space available. It keeps growing until it hits a limiting factor. Predation, competition, resource depletion, disease. Something eventually slows it down, but until it hits that limiting factor, it expands. So the real question isn't what Florida dumped. It isn't whether the program was well-intentioned. It isn't even whether the environmental benefits are as significant as the early data suggests, though that question matters enormously for how we think about scaling programs like this elsewhere. The real question is this: did they build reefs? Or did they start something that's going to reshape entire coastlines over the next century? Did they conduct a restoration project? Or did they set in motion a biological process that has its own momentum now? And if it's the latter, if what's forming off the coast of Florida is not a project but a process, then the implications extend well beyond one state's waste management program, because every coastal state in America has oyster shells going into landfills right now. Every coastal country in the world does, because every coastal community with a shellfish industry generates this material constantly. And if what Florida stumbled into, or planned its way into depending on who you ask, is actually a scalable template for rebuilding degraded coastal ecosystems using material that currently has no value, then we're not talking about a local success story. We're talking about a potential framework for one of the most cost-effective and self-sustaining forms of coastal restoration ever documented, which is why researchers who have spent careers being careful, measured, and cautious about preliminary data are using words they don't usually use. Not conclusive, not proven, but promising in ways that are unusual. Unusual enough to warrant attention, unusual enough to expand monitoring, Unusual enough to ask, if this works here, where else does it work? And unusual enough to sit with a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer yet. When nature takes over a process humans started and runs it better than the humans planned, is that a success or is that something else? Something we don't quite have a word for yet? Drop your thoughts below, because this isn't just about shells anymore. It's about what happens when you hand nature the right raw material and it decides what to build.